All right. So I'm going to firstly give you the call and then explain how did we reason behind that call. So we saw debate as first place going to the opening opposition, second place to the opening government, third place to the closing opposition, and the fourth place to the closing government. Now, let's start with the top half and explain why opening opposition takes over opening government. Now, opening government provides us with a couple of claims. Firstly, there is a frame in terms of how these organizations are going to look like. And the opening government chooses to take sort of a softer stance in terms of that these organizations will be a support group doing this in an empathetic way, that those will be individuals from that left those religions and therefore will be there to will know that religion, will have still some empathetic stances with that religion, so therefore they will unlikely to be very radical. They will do this in a nice way, and they will just help people in their like specific examples of views, specific bad experiences, someone not allowing you to live your life, etc. And generally some negative stuff that people might experience from the religion. So I think that like there is firstly this frame how this is going to look like, with some reasons why like the state wants this to be relatively functioning. These people want to be successful in their approach, therefore will try to be sort of a relatively moderate, etc. Now, secondly, there is an explanation of why state should do this in terms of state is already providing the tax exemptions, a lot of benefits to the religious organizations that sometimes unfortunately do harm individuals, and therefore what the fair thing would be is for state to also fund the organizations that are going to help the individuals if they want to leave these religious organizations for any reasons. Lastly, there are like some of the benefits of these organizations that they might provide, mostly in terms of information, but also the ability to have a community and to talk to someone, to people, to get the experiences that know what you're going through, etc. And also to provide you with some ability to live, either to direct resources if you need to move because you cannot longer live because you're like live in religion, or like to help you while you don't find a job, etc. So briefly, what open government explained to us is that firstly, there is necessity, even in Western liberal democracies, for these organizations to exist. Secondly, that like what are the benefits coming from these organizations? And thirdly, why state ought to do this simply as some kind of reparation for people because they were harmed by religion. Let's see how opening opposition reacts to these points and why they eventually defeat opening government. The first point of contention coming from opening government is to which extent, in the absence of state funding or state organizing, sort of contributing to these organizations, whether there is a way for people to leave the religion. And I think that here opening opposition engages with a lot of claims and a lot of reasons in terms of how people can still leave the religion in the absence of state funding here. Mostly we see the alternatives regarding the online resources like subreddits, forums, interactions with the individuals online, but also like generally the individuals who did leave the religion, who have the incentive, so again, a structural reason why someone would engage with this, to approach people, to help them, etc. We think that this responds to a lot of points regarding the community, regarding the information. So we think that a lot of things coming from opening government, what will be the benefits of these organizations, are somewhat mitigated because these benefits can occur with the alternative approaches to people who do want to leave the organization. We think that like the whole this frame of the like freer information, the ability to get to know stuff, etc., coming from opening opposition was sort of successful in explaining that people still, even if they live in the rural areas in Western liberal democracies, etc., still can probably access information, access people who can help them if they went through the abuses or to something so horrible, etc., and still will have some ability to get the help. So what I think that in the end is probably left sort of standing from opening government regarding of benefits of this organization is the funding, particularly for some of the things regarding the housing of individuals who might want to leave and like are sort of stuck in these organizations and things like that. And we believe that probably there is the funding point is comparatively standing on the opening government, but still even on this there are sort of other resources, as pointed out by opening opposition, other state services in these Western liberal democracies that can sort of, to some extent, counteract these ideas. So why are these responses important? They are important because they mitigate the scope of the benefits that opening government will get specifically with the state funding. And therefore, we felt that all of the benefits of these kind of organizations will likely occur to some reasonable extent also on the op world. Okay, now, what are the other stuff that opening opposition has besides this engagement that was mostly very mitigatory? Those are the harms. And the harms are concerning the backlash or like the reaction of religious organization to this policy, specifically coming from state. And I think that there are two areas in terms of how this backlash might get significantly worse. I think one is the area that this might be perceived as sort of losing the line that is sort of respected in the Western liberal democracies, the line separating church and the state, and that this as being perceived by the church will likely mean for church demanding some sort of other things that they're not getting in the status quo in order to counteract these policies. And given that religion has a lot of sort of influence, a lot of power, etc., they might be able to get some of these things. Now, opening government do point out that already religion is getting a lot of stuff like the free funding, like no taxes, funding, things like that. But still, we think that there is a comparative in terms of how much money you get from the state or how much stuff you can get from the state. And there's some logic that opening position has why this will increases the ability of church to get more funding, etc. But not only about the funding, there are some other specific stuff that opening opposition are talking about that are not necessarily linked to money and that are not necessarily happening in the status quo, and they're concerning the curricula in the school. So some stuff that they might want to sort of remove from curricula or some other stuff they might want to introduce, etc. So they're like, we're giving some possibility of church to like definitely more possibility for them to ask for these things, but also some possibility to get these things that might be harmful. The second idea regarding these backlash is sort of how the polarization that will occur as a consequence of this. And I think that this is mostly the idea, look, this becomes the political question. This is not anymore just some discussion that people are having on Reddit and subreddit, etc., that the church dislikes, but still is not in the center of attention, but rather this becomes the part of the discourse that is also part of the presidential elections, debates, and things like that. And that generally we're moving towards more radicalization in these kinds of questions, and that particularly church has sort of an interest to radicalize this discourse, particularly here, given that they feel threatened. Now, what is the impact of this? Is that the impact of sort of a moderate people who still respect institutions like church, etc., that they will be likely to simply need to pick the side, and given that these sides are becoming like more radicalized, they are going to more likely to pick up the side that is more pro-church, which just means that they become also more radical in their approaches, which means that maybe if now you respect the church, you would accept if your child just came out as atheist, but like maybe you would not be fully happy. In the world of opening opposition, you really dislike this. You are acting actively against those things. And once when these things happens, you make the hell for that child. So we felt it was a much clearer comparative here coming in terms of what the backlash is going to result to in terms of these individuals who do want to lead the church. Now, unfortunately, what we felt is that opening government doesn't fully engage with these specific things that would change under the backlash, which means the the polarization that comes from politicization that will result in more moderate people taking the extreme stances, which has a clear impact of individuals. And the second, the church getting a more political capital to demand the things they do not have now, simply for the secularism ideology that is now seen as sort of overcome by this policy. There are some sort of mitigations, some other mitigations, either preemptive or later reiterated in the second speech, in terms of, look, religion will be able to shut off this, like, oh, we are still like more powerful, people still trust in us because we are correct, etc. Some ways in terms of how church might spin this narrative, but it doesn't mean that they will not try to radicalize this narrative in the other ways as well. And this is something that we felt that both things can be true, but if both things are true, then open composition harms are still occurring. Now, what we do get then from, also the second reason why these analysis regarding the backlash is important, because it sort of challenges this frame of open government that these organizations will take a very soft approach, only approach it when necessary, in a very empathetic language, etc. Because if everything gets so polarizing and politicized as open composition is talking about, then probably it also affects these atheist organizations that you're funding, as explained by open composition. So in the end, what we saw in the top half was that most of the benefits coming from these organizations are mitigated by open composition, as they might occur in some other ways. That the backlash points, on the other hand, have some two very concrete harms that are not directly responded by open government. And therefore, when we compare open composition with open government, we have OO taking over OG. Okay, so let's move to the bottom half. Firstly, closing government. Now, closing government brings a lot of claims to this debate that we felt that we already received to a sufficient amount analyzed by opening government without seeing what is a qualitatively new importance of these contributions. So let's talk about them. Firstly, in terms of what do victims want and what are the benefits these groups can provide for the victims, where we receive two major reasons. One is that they can get the support groups, which is something that OG already mentions, and something that already open composition responds, that these kind of support groups can be found online and in the alternatives. But also, secondly, that they need sort of the human interactions, which is again very similar with something that opening government is talking about, that they need people who will understand them, the other people who went from these things. So we're not sure what is the distinct contribution of these human interactions. We felt it was a different way of saying the same thing as opening government is saying. Again, in terms of framing how these interactions are going to look like, it would be like, they'll ask you questions: are you happy? Are you suffering? Is religion abusive? Those are literally the things that opening government mentions, for example, in the prime minister's speech, in terms of how this will look like. So we see that all of these explanations of what these organizations are going to do and what will be their benefits are already there in opening government, sufficiently explained. And we don't know why this the CG's analysis, how much it is different and why this matters more than what OG does. Now, there are other things that also closing government adds. One of them is the funding. Again, funding is mentioned in to some extent in the second speech of the opening government, but also in the end of the first speech. Here we do have some additional analysis coming from closing government, which is, look, billionaires are unlikely to fund these charities because of their reputations or because they might not care, which is, and it is very hard for you to get the attention and therefore forget people who are getting your funding, which sure gives us some more reasons why maybe state funding is sort of more secure, but it doesn't show us that if the prop wins, we have this state funding that will just have this organization fully functioning, but without the state funding, we have like completely dysfunctioning these organizations. So it was not sure what is the differences. Surely there is some differences in funding. You give some more explanation than OG why there's differences in funding, but why is that more explanation for that particular aspect of these organizations so important in terms of determining whether the state should fund them or not? Apart from that, we also have the moral responsibility point, which goes something like, look, if states is there to protect people, to protect individuals, to sort of do once when they are sort of harmed, particularly vulnerable individuals that you're talking about, but also sort of state allows for a church to operate, and therefore they might be complicit in some instances in these harms, etc. Again, this is something that we receive from open government, just said with the, like sort of different words, like these people are vulnerable, they need our help, they live in rural areas, state is giving tax breaks to the church and sort of in a way helping the discrimination. Surely, like maybe some aspects are a bit differently said, but this is eventually the same line of argumentation. So what we receive from closing government is that a lot of claims that unfortunately for CG were already to a very large extent developed by opening government. And though there are some, maybe some small addendums, we never see why these particular lines that were new or maybe added are more relevant than what OG brings to the debate. Similarly, regarding the opening opposition, like obviously the transitivity prohibits CG from taking over opening up if they're losing to opening government, but still, the direct responses to the 2 points that are still standing up to the top half, which is the polarization of discourse resulting in middlemen becoming more extreme, and secondly, the church demanding more stuff because the secularism is perceived as no longer being such a virtue, are still 2 points that are standing. And given that those are the 2 strongest points regarding the clash that OO is winning, we felt that we needed, and given that CG mostly have derivative analysis from OG, we needed concrete and strong responses to these 2 points from OO in order for CG to take over opening opposition. So for these reasons, closing government loses to the top half teams. Now, let's introduce the closing opposition to the debate. Now, there are a couple of contributions that we get from the closing opposition. One of them is, look, state will want to justify this funding, and therefore this will influences these organizations acting in a more radical or a negative way, resulting in some negative externalities for these organizations themselves. Now, what issues do I have with these claims? Firstly, sort of the premise is the same as the one that opening position has, like state needs to justify these, like these funding, but maybe the direction of the argument is definitely different. However, I'm not really sure why, like, okay, I can understand the state is bureaucratic. I can understand that the state prefers the short term and like the election cycles and those things rather than the long term. But I'm really not sure why this will mean that these organizations will have to behave in such an aggressive way that's going to be perceived as harmful from everyone else. Because like there are 2 scenarios. Either this aggressive and a very radical way is going to be successful in getting people to like not stop being religious, in which case all of the like benefits that like opening government, for example, has, that people are like sort of coerced in religion, there are many issues with them, they might be oppressed, etc., then they occur to a larger extent because you get these people out of the religion. So we don't see why, with all these benefits, still this is worse, simply because these kind of organizations are going to behave like, it seems that they will just be doing their jobs better, like if that is correct. But if they, the second scenario, which is probably like more likely, is that you're not successful in conversions, but you're still more aggressive. In which way, I don't understand why these organizations will do this. Because if state wants to have the short-term gains, like if they're not getting these gains, why the organizations will behave in this way? And then there is another aspect here in terms of these public protests and demonstrations that might occur, which is like Sure, this might be one way of how the organizations will react, but I don't see how it is explained why this is the only way how the organizations can react in order to justify the funding that they are getting from the state. So it seems to me that there are lots of the premises in terms of how the organizations are going to behave, and they are sort of intertwined with some aspects of the state. State has bureaucracy, short-termism, without actually all things being combined, and telling me how bureaucracy and short-termism means that the organizations are behaving in this way, and what are the concrete harms happening from this, rather than just sort of saying, oh, but like it's going to be perceived negatively, etc. So it was a bit unclear of why this characterization of state, that surely state is bureaucratic and state is like politicians care about short term, but like why this will mean that the organizations will have to behave so drastically problematic, and because of that is something that we felt was unexplained. The second idea that we got is the idea about minorities, which I think is a very interesting aspect that sadly closing opposition doesn't develop fully, which is to say that there is a asymmetry in terms of how Western liberal democracies are treating majority and minority religion, which might be with this policy might sort of have certain effects here. But unfortunately, the analysis literally stops there. Like there will be oppressing a minority and hating minorities, etc. We wanted to hear more here. We want to hear the full explanation, the full argument. What will be the impact of minorities? How they'll be targeted more? Like what changes? It seems that it was just, unfortunately for closing opposition, only on the level of claim. So in terms of the positive contributions, we felt that the closing opposition doesn't fully like finish their argumentation, and therefore it is difficult to place them above, for example, opening opposition that do have like more like step-by-step from the premise to the harm. And the secondly, again, it was difficult to take this contribution as sufficient to defeat opening government that still has some explanation of why the state ought to fund these organizations. Now, besides of this, there are some points of like responses, rebuttal, mostly in terms of why funding is not so detrimental, in terms of explaining why even in the absence of funding, still there will be some alternatives, way of people getting these access to these institutions. And there is also explanation, look, there are some people who are altruistic, who work because they want to share their sort of to help other people who were like in their kind of shoes, or there are other aspects of funding that you might get from like people who were in the similar situation, or even some private individuals, etc., which we felt was some kind of mitigation to the point of opening government that the funding is important, but still not. Comparatively, we felt that the state had just a more steady and secure income rather than these alternative sources of funding. So therefore, we felt was mostly on the level of mitigation. So again, with OO, like most of the material is not fully developed in closing opposition, so that we see that definitely these impacts occur, or what is the relevance of these impacts. With open government, we do not have the really full engagement, only some kind of mitigation to some of the points, and also sort of OG simply develops their orientation much more than CO, therefore takes over CO, sorry. Now, CG versus CO, we felt it was a close comparative here. However, we felt that there are two reasons why CO takes over CG. One is that in terms of the new material being brought, that we felt that the closing opposition, though they didn't fully finish most of their like lines, we don't necessarily trust their claims like the most, we still felt that there is some merit in terms of state having pernicious incentive, and also in terms of how organizations operate, and also in terms of minority religions being harmed, that like still have some possibility to sort of stand. And secondly, we felt that more importantly, in terms of the engagement, that some of the engagement of closing opposition was effective mitigation of some of the points coming from the prop, while on the other hand, we felt that the a lot of engagement with the mostly opening composition, but also closing composition was missing in the closing government. So we felt that in terms of better engagement and slightly more relevance in the points that are new and that are brought, we valued closing composition more than closing government. Okay, are there any questions for the call? Yeah, okay, hopefully I didn't steal too much of your time. Okay, so